acknowledge them. So I think the Ngāti Tiipa example, although it's early days yet, is an example of how, with not much money, but with a lot of commitment and desire, we can use the fragments of data about us that sit in public repositories, bring them to our own space, layer on our own mātauranga, decide our own purposes, and make it work for us. We're not a post-settlement iwi. We don't have big infrastructure. We don't have multi-million-dollar putia, far from it. And so the value we see in the work that we're trying to achieve is that we might be able to develop a methodology that might be useful for other whānau and hapu groupings that really value their whakapapa and want to bring it together under their control as well. But it also has broader relevance for in the national and international context. And here I want to segue a little bit, just briefly, into the work that I've been doing with Māori and Indigenous data sovereignty. So I'm not sure if you would have heard of the language of data sovereignty, or whether any of you probably would, being in this sector, any of the former speakers would have mentioned it, but the EU's GDPR is an example of data sovereignty that tries to bring data regulation firmly under the control of a national or regional jurisdiction. The Chinese government passed some laws requiring that all cloud computing and Chinese customer data be hosted on servers in China. The Russian government has been blocking Google and Amazon cloud services, and there's many other countries that are trying to regulate in some way how data can be stored and transmitted, and the locus of control is the nation state. And that's the conversation about data sovereignty, which is really a jurisdictional one. Now, Indigenous data sovereignty really flips that locus of control and states that the data is subject to the laws of the nation from which the data originate or are collected, including tribal nations. So it shifts that locus of control away from the nation state back to the people. And Māori data sovereignty takes it one further step and refers to the inherent rights and interests that Māori have in relationship to the collection, ownership, and application of Māori data. So in terms of just kind of giving a sense of how this is kind of going global, and it is multi-level. So these issues do matter at the flax roots, in the work that we're doing with Ngāti Tiipa, that's the flax roots. It's genuinely flax roots. It does matter in the national level. We're having all these national conversations, and it certainly matters at the international level as well. So here in Aotearoa, we've got Te Mana Raraunga, which is the Māori Data Sovereignty Network. There's data sovereignty networks that in the last 2 years have sprung up in the US through the Native Nations Institute, University of Arizona, also the University of Tasmania. This is the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Data Sovereignty Group, and emerging networks in Sweden and Canada. There's the FNIGC, and also this Research Data Alliance, Indigenous Data Sovereignty Interest Group, horrible name, even worse acronym, but it's sponsored by the NSF and the EU and the Australian Ministry for, I think, Productivity or Innovation, and their whole motivation really is promoting data sharing and open data and data-driven research, and in a way that sits very uncomfortably with some of the concerns and the rights and interest claims made by Indigenous data sovereignty, but is absolutely in those difficult places that you need to have those difficult conversations. That's where we need to be, rather than closing the door and saying we actually can't engage with you in a conversation. So this is a website here for Te Mana Raraunga, and you can go to the website and have a look and see what it's all about. But it's basically an informal advocacy group. And it's an informal advocacy group that's championing data rights and interests, data governance, data storage and security, and data access and control. And it's advocating for the development of capacity and capability across the Māori data ecosystem, which is really, really broad. So I said before, when I was defining the terms of Māori data sovereignty, the question that always arises is, well, how can you even define the parameters of what Māori data is? Is it kind of everything and anything? And there's no one concrete definition, but the working one that we're using to enable us to kind of talk about this with some sort of clarity is that it's about information or knowledge that's in a digital or a digitizable form that is about or from Māori peoples and our environments, regardless of who controls it. Because the reality is that only about 5% of Māori data is actually controlled by Māori people and organisations. Most of the data about us, through a whole range of reasons, is actually controlled by other people, whether that's the Crown or whether that's private enterprise and so forth. So if we only limited it to the data we actually have control of, that would be a very short conversation. So an example of data that's from Māori is Māori iwi or organisations. About Māori generated from other, there's a massive integrated data infrastructure that some of you may be aware of, and data about Māori resources. Māori land is a classic example about that. And it's really about how do you, it's not data for data's sake as much as I love data, but it's how do you use that data to enable self-determination and innovation. And there's two strands to Māori data governance. One is around access and use, and one is around governance and control. And we're having a conversation with an international data security expert talking about treaty rights and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And he said, you know what, you can have all these rights and interests and you can link them to mechanisms that state them and enable them, but really what you're talking about is control. When it comes down to it, where's your mechanism of control? And do you have that control in the law, or do you have that control because you own an entity that actually controls the data? And we said, actually, no, we have nothing. So what's the mechanism for control in this sector? The mechanism for control really is through data governance. And from a Māori data sovereignty perspective, that data governance has to be principled. It has to recognise and honour mātauranga Māori and tikanga Māori. And it has to have the well-being and interests of Māori people right at the heart of it. So recently we put together, as part of Te Mana Raraunga, a set of really high-level principles pertaining to Māori data sovereignty that might act as a little bit of a guide as how do you take sort of an abstract concept and turn that into something which is a little more concrete. It may not work in each and every situation, because then you have to go down another layer and kind of operationalise it and implement it in a way that makes sense to the context that you're working in. But these are high-level principles that are tikanga informed, that sort of embody the key values that underpin this idea of Māori data sovereignty. So I just want to finish by sharing briefly a little bit about this. And these can be available they're available on the Te Mana Raraunga website. You can just go there and download them. But I just want to point out here that a key part of this is around the ethical use of data to enhance the well-being of our people, our language, and our culture. So it's data sovereignty for a purpose, not just as a means to an end. And these are the three principles that I think, there's 6 principles, I'm not going to go through them all, but I think that might be most relevant perhaps for the work that you do in the different sectors that you're involved in. And one of them is around rangatiratanga, which the first one is around control, that Māori have an inherent right to exercise control over Māori data and Māori data ecosystems. And this includes, but isn't limited to, creation, collection, access, analysis, interpretation, management, security, dissemination, use and reuse of Māori data. There's a lot of stuff in there. That's a lot of principles, a lot of processes that have to be worked through. Jurisdiction and self-determination. The Māori have the right to data that's relevant and empowers sustainable self-determination and effective self-governance. The second one, and I think this is really important, particularly in the GLAM sector as well, and this is one that we came across when we were doing our Ngāti Tiipa whakapapa, is balancing rights. And because most of the regulatory framework, the GDPR is a classic example of this, is all very much formulated on this idea of personal data protection and personal concepts of privacy, and it doesn't cater to the notion of the collective or the group. So in our principles, we recognise that we have to balance rights, so it's not just about individuals. In fact, in Te Ao Māori, very rarely is it just about individuals. In our Ngāti Tiipa work, it's all about the collective. It's just figuring out who that collective is. Is it the whānau? Is it the tūpuna line? Is it the papakainga? So here in our principles, we have the individual rights and risks and benefits in relation to data. They need to be balanced with those of the group of which they are a part. And in some contexts, those collective rights actually prevail over the rights of individuals. And that's like, in a Western liberal kind of democracy, that is like waving a red flag at a bull to say that the rights of the collective might prevail over the rights of the individual. But this is in our data sovereignty principles. And that there's also a need for strong accountabilities. So those individuals, those organisations, those public repositories that are a lot more secure than my mum's blue travelling trunk, those institutions that are responsible for the collection and the creation is really important for the kaupapa of this conference, the management, the access, the security, all that stuff to do with data, they are accountable to the communities, to the groups, to the individuals from whom that data derive. And finally, kaitiakitanga, principles around guardianship and ethics, and bringing to the fore tikanga, kawa, mātauranga, they must underpin the protection, the access and the use of Māori data. And in terms of restrictions, as we move to an increasingly open data environment, there's such a push to make anything and everything open. But when it comes to Māori data, it should be Māori who decide which Māori data are open and which are closed and continue to maintain restricted access. So this is all really important. I mean, you can get kind of caught up in your own little hobbies, but this is actually an important national conversation because we all know now that data is the world's most wealthy resource. It is the most important strategic and economic resource. And in New Zealand, the government, previous governments and probably the current government as well, still has grand ambitions for New Zealand to be if not the world leader, certainly a world leader in the trusted use of shared data. So there's an increasing recognition that data is a national strategic resource. And so there's a lot of motivations to open up data, to link it and to share it. And as the technology race is ahead, we need to ensure that our principled approach to how that occurs is actually going ahead of the technology. At the moment, I feel that it's lagging behind. So that kind of brings us back to the questions I think that weigh heavily on my mind these days, and which really kind of the entry point for this talk, which is whose data, under whose control, using whose ethics, and for whose benefit. And I think I'll leave it there. I'm not sure if I have question time. I can't actually see my watch properly.
Yeah, there's time for questions. Do we have any questions? Mike Edson said that we should just wait and that there will be a question.
Sometimes you need to mull over things.
Yeah.
There are lots of questions.
You can always tweet at me as well.
Matariki.
Kia ora, I was just wondering if this model that you have of your pāharakeke for Ngāti Tiipa, is this model shareable so that other iwi may grow their own pāharakeke?
It will be. At the moment, we're not. And actually, Vanessa Roimata Clark, who's my cousin, who is really leading our IT and tikanga wānanga, she's kind of built that embryo of that as a map for our whānau as we move ahead. It's not shareable now because there's so many elements to it that we actually haven't figured out. But what we're doing is we're trying to document that the data will never be shareable, but the methodology and the roadmap will be. And so what we're trying to do at the moment is document the methodology because, you make mistakes as you go along. So trying to do that in a clear way so that will absolutely be shareable. But there'll be IP parts to it as well that Vanessa is kind of working through. But at the moment, we're not kind of sharing this far and wide and putting it on the internet and stuff. I wanted to include it today so that you can kind of visualise what we're trying to achieve. But it's still pretty early days yet, and we still have so far to go. But that's ultimately, we'd love to be able to do that as a koha to other whānau and hapu groups.
Glenn. Microphone down here.
So, is there any, as you've been going through this, is there any actually data or content that people have felt they have wanted to share? They have wanted to share rather than keep private? Is there some stuff they go, no, we actually really want to get this out into the world?
Yeah, so we've had, so like I said, we started with all the public stuff first and brought that in because that was a safe place to start. But as we've got more people connected and gone through it, people have bought their whakapapa books. We actually haven't done anything with them yet because it would be preemptive. Until we've gone through the exercise, the tikanga wānanga and the exercise, we feel that it wouldn't be ethical to get people just to sign kind of waivers and forms. Oh yes, I agree to this going into the pāhara keke, and everybody from Ngāti Tiipa can have access to it. Like, I think before we need to go collectively through the process of wānaunga the tikanga, and then people can make a decision about whether they want that whakapapa only available to descendants up to a certain generation, or whether they want anybody who has a whakapapa linkage to them to be able to access it. All those tricky questions we haven't worked out yet. Yeah.
Another one. Oh, yeah.
Ngā mihi nui for sharing this with us at this early stage and being so open with us. And I was just wondering how that sort of intersection of public data, which you've incorporated, which is already in the public realm, how you will work with that going forward, because obviously some of it already exists in the public space, and how you kind of work at that boundary, that sort of intersection between public and iwi specific, or data that benefits the iwi specifically.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tricky space because it is in public repositories, and anybody can walk off the street and get it, digitise it and take it home, whatever, do what they want with it. There's no restrictions around it. But the thing is I had that slide with my dad in the middle, poring over. Actually, you can get all those fragments, but if you don't know what to do with them, that's where the local intelligence, that's where the layering on of mātauranga becomes absolutely fundamental. It actually changes the nature of the information. So for one example, he's got stuff from a Māori land court where you're just kind of reading out lists of names. Now, to take those lists of names, to integrate them with other knowledge and to put them in these massive, like he was taping together like 20 pieces of A3, and then I had to figure a way to photocopy them and we'd put them up on the wall and hand them out at our wānanga. That process of putting that together, that shouldn't be publicly accessible, we feel, even if the component bits that contributed to it started life in a public repository. So it's all that kind of tricky, what's public, what's private, and that's why the tikanga is absolutely kind of so important. And as we're looking around, there's actually not a lot to guide us with this, and this is why we're having to develop it ourselves. So I don't think I gave you a very clear answer, and I think that's because I don't have a clear answer at this stage.
And that's what's going on in my head. Someone, I think it was Brene Brown, said that data are stories that haven't been told yet. And then listening to Tahu today, it's whose data, whose control, whose ethics, whose benefit, who gets to tell those stories, who gets to hear those stories. And then if we've got component parts, but the mataranga, the people with the mataranga are the ones that need to tell those stories and share those stories. What is it that we can do in the GLAM sector to honour your tikanga and your sovereignty of your own data and make sure that we are helping you as much as we can in the right way? Yep. And that's what I've taken from today, and I think that we need to keep talking. And I hope that this community is we can keep talking and supporting your mahi and your iwi. And I just learned so much. Thank you so much. Kia ora. We have a little something for you.
Oh, thank you.